Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
In the echoes of history, amid forgotten tales and shadows of erased voices, lies a story woven with tragedy and resistance, the systematic elimination of Black Indian leaders. These figures, born of two rich heritages, were not only symbols of unity, but also bridges between two worlds, the African and indigenous American. Their existence posed a direct threat to colonial systems built upon division, hierarchy, and control. Their courage and leadership, however, became the very reasons for their persecution, exile, and ultimate demise. The mixed-race Black Indian leaders were neither accidents of history nor anomalies of circumstance. They were purposeful products of the struggles, resilience, and blending of cultures that occurred during some of the darkest periods of human civilization. European colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and the displacement of indigenous nations carved a brutal and violent legacy in the Americas. Amidst this chaos, African slaves and indigenous peoples found each other, sharing stories, bloodlines, and rebellion. Yet, history has often buried these leaders, ascribing them to myths or silencing their contributions altogether. To reclaim this history is to unearth the brutal realities of colonial machinations, a deliberate system that targeted mixed-race leaders who embodied a dangerous unity. They were seen as threats to the status quo, people who could unite oppressed groups into powerful coalitions. To colonial powers, such leaders had to be stopped, and so they were systematically eliminated. This article seeks to resurrect the forgotten lives of these Black Indian leaders who were systematically murdered, betrayed, or erased. It will explore the roots of their struggle, their legacy as mixed-race revolutionaries, and the meticulous, brutal methods through which they were targeted and eliminated. To understand this story, we must first trace the roots of their identities and examine the colonial systems that feared and sought to destroy their existence. It is a story of humanity's darkest ambitions, but it is also one of love, survival, and the enduring fight for justice and unity. To understand why Black Indian leaders were targeted for systematic elimination, it is essential to appreciate the convergence of two monumental struggles, the African enslavement and indigenous displacement under European colonization. These two struggles ran parallel, yet they intersected in profound ways that colonial powers did not anticipate. From the early days of European exploration and conquest in the Americas, African slaves were forcibly brought to foreign lands to perform grueling labor under inhumane conditions. Simultaneously, indigenous populations faced displacement, land theft, and genocide as settlers expanded their colonial empires. These two groups, though victims of distinct oppressions, found themselves bound by shared suffering, survival, and a yearning for freedom. Africans who escaped enslavement often found refuge among indigenous nations. Many Native American tribes, understanding the nature of colonial oppression, embraced escaped slaves into their communities. Over time, African and indigenous peoples built connections that went beyond survival. They shared cultural practices, languages, and resistance strategies. Intermarriages became common, and children born of these unions represented both African and indigenous lineages, a blending of two oppressed but powerful heritages. The mixed-race children who grew from these unions embodied a new generation of leadership. Many became influential figures within their communities, rising to positions of authority and becoming symbols of unity. These Black Indian leaders were both African and Native, inheriting the struggles of two peoples and emerging as voices of rebellion and hope. However, it was this very identity that painted a target on their backs. The colonial powers viewed the existence of Black Indian leaders as a dangerous precedent. If African slaves and indigenous tribes united under strong leadership, they could challenge colonial rule, disrupt plantation economies, and resist land dispossession. To colonial systems dependent on division, hierarchy, and fear, these leaders were intolerable. The systematic targeting and elimination of Black Indian leaders were not random acts of violence, but a deliberate colonial strategy. European powers, recognizing the potential threat posed by these figures, employed calculated methods to weaken their influence and erase their legacy. Colonial governments and settlers understood that unity among oppressed groups, especially under the leadership of a charismatic and influential leader, could destabilize their hold over lands and people. One of the most insidious aspects of this strategy was the manipulation of division and betrayal. Colonial authorities often pitted indigenous nations and African communities against each other, using incentives, promises, and outright deception to create distrust. Leaders who sought to unify these groups were targeted as agitators, their movements infiltrated and undermined. The methods of elimination varied. Some Black Indian leaders were assassinated, their deaths framed as accidents or the result of tribal conflicts. Others were captured, tried, and executed under colonial laws that deemed them rebels or criminals. Still, others were betrayed from within, sold out by those coerced or manipulated by colonial powers. The psychological warfare was just as brutal. Colonial propaganda painted Black Indian leaders as dangerous, immoral, or savage figures who posed a threat to social order. By controlling narratives and spreading misinformation, colonial authorities sought to delegitimize these leaders and isolate them from their own communities. The systematic elimination of Black Indian leaders was not only physical but also ideological, as their contributions and legacies were buried under layers of historical silence. The stories of betrayal among Black Indian leaders reveal the deeply fractured world in which they lived. The colonial systems often co-opted individuals within indigenous and African communities, exploiting their fears, poverty, or aspirations for survival. For many Black Indian leaders, their downfall came not at the hands of distant colonial powers but through betrayal by those they trusted. Yet, even in their deaths, these leaders left behind legacies that could not be fully erased. They inspired revolts, rebellions, and alliances that shook colonial foundations. Their stories live on through oral traditions, cultural memories, and historical fragments that refuse to fade. The resistance embodied by Black Indian leaders was revolutionary. Their leadership demonstrated the potential for unity between oppressed peoples, a vision that terrified colonial empires. Even as they were systematically targeted, their movements inspired future generations to resist division and seek liberation. One of the most insidious consequences of the systematic elimination of Black Indian leaders is the historical silence that followed. Their stories were deliberately buried, omitted from official records, or reduced to footnotes in history books. By erasing these leaders, colonial powers sought to erase the very possibility of unity and resistance that they represented. Historical erasure was not accidental, but part of the same strategy that led to their elimination. By controlling history, colonial powers sought to control the future, to ensure that the descendants of African slaves and indigenous peoples would not find strength in their shared struggles. The erasure of Black Indian leaders was an attempt to fracture collective memory and prevent the formation of future alliances. Yet, history is resilient. The stories of these leaders survive in the oral traditions of indigenous tribes, in the songs and folklore of African descendants, and in the fragments of documents that refuse to be forgotten. By reclaiming these stories, we challenge the erasure and honor the sacrifices of those who dared to unite the oppressed. The systematic elimination of Black Indian leaders stands as one of history's most deliberate and brutal acts of colonial oppression. These figures, born of two powerful heritages, embodied unity, resistance, and hope in a world divided by violence and greed. Their lives and deaths tell a story of courage and betrayal, of love and loss, and of a vision that could not be fully extinguished. To remember these leaders is to reclaim a legacy of unity that continues to inspire struggles for justice and freedom today. Their stories remind us that the bonds between oppressed peoples are not accidents of history, but deliberate acts of survival and love. The colonial systems that sought to divide and destroy them ultimately failed, for their legacy lives on in the resilience of their descendants and the enduring fight for liberation. The murder of Black Indian leaders was a tragedy, but it was not the end of their story. Their voices, silenced but not forgotten, call to us from history, urging us to remember, resist, and reclaim the unity they fought for.